The U.S. election has global implications. It'll also impact America's role in global institutions and on the world stage. I'm Jon Gordon from the UBS Chief Investment Office in Hong Kong. In this three-part special series on the U.S. election for Circle One, we're very pleased to have Oriana Skylar Master with us, a geopolitical strategist, a Stanford professor, and author of the new book, Upstart, How China Became a Great Power. Oriana, thanks for making the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So November 5 is arriving amid this sort of crescendo of geopolitical tensions from the Mideast to Ukraine and also the South China Sea and China. Before we get into the specifics, I'm curious what you see as the defining differences between Trump and Harris in terms of international relations and their geopolitical approach.
Well, I'm going to answer that question in the context of Asia. My main area of expertise is on the Chinese military, security, and strategy, U.S.-China relations. And while my Chinese colleagues, with whom I talk extensively with about the U.S. election, don't see a huge difference between a Harris or a Trump, from the U.S. perspective, I think there's a massive difference and an opportunity that's really being missed here. So from the outside, it looks like there's been some sort of consensus reached in the United States about U.S.-China relations and about China, and that President Harris and President Trump are both going to have a pretty competitive approach to China in the economic space. For example, export control is likely to increase, tariffs as well, regardless of who is president. But I think it's important to decipher why the two parties feel that way. And for a Harris administration, I think it's largely because of behavior, different views on how the United States and China should interact with each other. This leaves an opening for an improvement of the relations between the two sides. A Trump administration sees things in a bit more of an ideological stance, and that makes it a bit harder to move things forward. So on one hand, it can be, from the perspective of U.S.-China relations, perhaps better for a Trump administration in that, President Trump can be somewhat unpredictable. He gets along well with Xi Jinping, some other people that maybe President Harris wouldn't get along with. But on the other, President Harris is going to have probably an emphasized approach continued from the Biden administration on U.S. allies and partners. So we'll continue to see the U.S. relationship with countries in Asia, in particular Japan, Australia, and the Philippines continue to improve during her administration. So there's a little bit of good and bad for each approach.
Totally get that. So maybe let's dive into a potential second Trump presidency. How would that differ from his first term? Does he still have this capacity to shock and challenge norms? And do you feel like, when you talk to these different countries, are they prepared for tariffs? Are they prepared for sort of that unpredictability as you described it?
Well, one of the concerns, or I guess considerations in DC is who's going to be a part of this second Trump administration. There's a lot of individuals, with whom I have worked very closely with, continue to work closely with, that for a variety of reasons will not serve in a second administration. My prediction is I see probably a lot of retired military personnel making up this administration. That's because you have these individuals that have positive reputations, extensive leadership experience, but no political opinions on record. And so that can be, pretty attractive to bring people from the outside, that being only one example. And so, what is the Trump administration going to be like? I think you really, you hit the mark here. It's really unpredictable. We could go everything from, Trump administration that is much more isolationist, because there is that aspect of the party, of the Republican Party, in which they're not as involved in international institutions. They pulled out a lot of those in the first Trump administration. They alienate allies and partners, based on some of their behavior and their rhetoric. And maybe some of that isolationism would also be welcome in countries that currently have somewhat conflictual relationships with the United States, like a Russia or a China or Iran, for example. So I think the unpredictability of a President Trump can create both dangerous situations and positive situations. So the dangerous situation is, politics is complex, and especially when it comes to U.S.-China relations and situations over Taiwan, understanding what U.S. policy is and what the United States has committed to doing and not doing is very important. President Trump violated a lot of those norms in his first administration. I think the government of China understood that maybe he didn't understand all those things and didn't respond in a strong way to those violations. But it's always possible that a President Trump goes across the line. And so that is of a concern, I think, to many people who are looking at what the U.S. role in Asia would be under a President Trump.
Interesting. So deterrence through clarity versus deterrence through unpredictability. Now, Trump said he would act to swiftly end the Russia-Ukraine war. I imagine that might mean a resolution that's more favorable to Russia than perhaps Ukraine would like. How would you see that rippling across, not just Russia-Ukraine, but also the other U.S. relationships and some of these global flashpoints where, the world looks to the U.S. for leadership?
Well, let me just say, first and foremost, I'm not a Russia expert, but I look at how this conflict is really influencing perspectives, viewpoints, and behaviors in Asia. I think you are correct in your assessment that any attempts to bring this war to an end are going to have to come with some sort of concession to Russia. That's not the current administration's position, and rightfully so. No one wants to reward aggression and bad behavior. But, that's a normative stance. If you're going to be realistic about it, it doesn't look like Russia's going to stop fighting unless they get something out of it. So there's going to have to be some sort of concession in which Russia gains some territory that may be, won by negative means, but still they'll have to gain some territory. And it's possible that a President Trump would be more willing to accommodate that than President Harris. Now, what does that mean for the region, for the rest of the world? Realistically speaking, Ukraine is not an ally of the United States. The United States has never committed to defend Ukraine. Ukraine is not strategically important compared to some of our other allies and partners. Europe is no longer really the fulcrum of the international system. The future lies in Asia. So just because the United States was willing to make some concessions to allow that war to come to an end doesn't necessarily tell us a lot about what the U.S. position would be in conflicts in Asia. That being said, that's a very sort of logical way of looking at it. A lot of polling, on the other hand, suggests that the populations in a lot of these places are looking to how the United States is going to handle Ukraine to make assessments about, the credibility of the United States as a partner. So that's going to be a very difficult line to toe for the United States to say, listen, we're only so committed to Ukraine because resources are limited and we are even more committed to you. But it seems to me when I read a lot of those pollings that while I 100% believe that is true, that message is not coming off very clearly in Asian capitals.
What are the meaningful ways in which she might diverge from President Biden's approach? What could be the surprises, perhaps against this sort of steady-on view that you articulated earlier?
Well, it depends if I'm having an optimistic or pessimistic day. I know a lot of members of her team very closely, and I'm very supportive of a lot of the Biden administration's efforts, in particular of building up the U.S. military position in Asia and strengthening our alliances and partnerships. Right now, and a lot of this is campaigning, so it's hard to tell what she would actually do in office because, as you mentioned, we don't have a big record to go on. But some of her comments about what she sees as the greatest challenges and threats to the United States, which are very Middle East focused, concern me. Because whatever, and I have a lot of critiques of all administrations. I say, to a lot of my clients when I'm doing geopolitical risk, like I have something for everyone to hate, right? But when it comes to what she says about the Middle East, the bottom line is the Trump administration did take a positive direction in refocusing U.S. efforts on Asia and understanding that Asia, was really the future and that U.S. interests in Asia had to be prioritized. So when I hear Vice President Harris make statements about the most important things being what's happening in the Middle East, it does concern me that maybe we would go backwards and like, the lost decade, which is often referred to after 9/11, refocus on things that are going on in the Middle East at the detriment of the stability and future of Asia.
All right, interesting. Okay, well, let me press you perhaps on what you have heard about Harris's view on China and her likely approach. You said some of the people on the team. Would things like AUKUS be reinforced under a potential Harris administration? Would some of the China policy architects that really stood out from the Biden admin also stay on, the Blinkens or the Raimondos that really moved the needle on sort of China engagement?
So I think the broad contours are going the same. The desire to maintain the international liberal order, the U.S. leadership, role in that order. Some personalities are probably going to switch out. My sense is that Vice President Harris are going to want some of her own people in those positions versus President Biden's people. And as she's moving forward and trying to gain her ground on Asia policy, I think a big question comes about how risk averse she is. So this really determines the nature of a lot of these policies, the degree of tariffs, export controls, U.S. military activity in Asia. All of these, of course, are activities of the United States that China is not happy with. And so one of the big things that varies from leader to leader is how much is that important to them? How much are they willing to risk upsetting Beijing? And I think President Biden was much more assertive about things than I expected him to be. Given my work with his team before he was elected, I thought that maybe they were going to take a step back from some of Trump's more assertive policies, and to my surprise, they didn't. So I am expecting a President Harris to continue along that line, but it is possible as things heat up and as tensions increase between the United States and China that, she might get a little bit of cold feet and then push the envelope a little bit less. But I think the general contours of the United States working with allies and partners, trying to enhance the legitimacy of the U.S. role as a global leader and as the security partner of choice will continue.
I guess it also depends a bit on the economy that she's handed by the time she takes over, if she does indeed win the election. You've argued the U.S. geopolitical approach is heavily constrained by the 4-year election cycle. The heavy partisanship we see just makes it really difficult to do these sort of strategic multi-year decisions. So what are the realistic paths to sort of sidestep this, to really reform this so the U.S. has more capacity to take a long-term view?
Well, this is hard. I think it's not only the political system. The way that it works is no one wants to really put forth a policy or an effort unless there's a 100% success rate. I like to say to people in the private sector, working in defense, it's like if someone told the CEO of a company, you have to put a plan together and you're not allowed to touch it or change it for 30 years. How would that company do 30 years later? That's kind of the dynamics we're working with at the Department of Defense. I think one of the sort of silver linings, however, is about how maybe independent or sticky some of these institutions are, right? That regardless of who the executive is, there are plans in place, programs in place. The United States has certain foreign policy principles that it works by. So there's certain things that continue on no matter what. But if you're asking me, I am very vocal about needing a more entrepreneurial approach. The United States just thinking differently about everything, from how we engage with other countries to what our alliances consist of. And there's very little room for that level of innovation in policy. I think part of it is the hubris of being the great power, and part of it is what is better than what you don't know. And when people get into power, they want to stay in power. I always half joke that if I ever decided to go in government, if I didn't get fired from my job, I would consider it a failure in my policy, because I'm very much about pushing the envelope on some of these things. And so it's a cultural issue. It's an organizational issue. People are trying to shift, but it's going to take a lot more than 4 years.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So let me circle back to some of those comments you made earlier about the sort of the consensus in Washington on China. You said that there is some difference between the two camps. I'd say broadly, though, it seems to be characterized by this agreement on the expansion of leading edge tech export controls, reshoring, friendshoring activities, subsidies to support chips and other strategic sectors, and national security-led restrictions limiting market access for Chinese companies in areas like EVs, for example. So it's broad consensus there. Where does this framing, in your view, lead us in terms of the sort of more confrontational approach to the global economy and sort of a more, I guess more of a controlled approach, right? Which is a bit different from what has been the U.S. sort of free market sense framework for so long.
Absolutely right. I think when we talk about the different degrees of consensus, there is much more of a consensus in the economic space than there is in the political and military space between the two sides. Now, in terms of, where is this going? People who work in these spaces, obviously, things like prosperity, growth, innovation, these are the number one objectives. But in international politics, a lot of times power is more important than prosperity. People always ask me when it comes to territory, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine and everyone was so surprised, in my world, of course, that's what they did, because that's what countries do. And in a lot of cases, they're building those economic resources and they're trying to leverage them to achieve other objectives that aren't just economically focused. And so along those lines, it's the Chinese government, if you look at their 5-year plans or science and technology plans, the internal debate about the United States and their own rise, there was always the expectation that at some point the United States was going to close, the faucet on this, right? So it is confrontational to a degree. And whenever I talk to Chinese government officials, my favorite question is to ask them is like, what are the 3 things you hate the most right now about the United States? Because I really want to focus on like, what are the policies that are really, having the most impact, like for better or for worse? And the export controls are always number 1, like even more than the tariffs from their perspective. But it's not, I don't think it's as confrontational as maybe it seems from the outside, because there was that expectation in Beijing that at a certain level of relative power, that was going to happen. So where is this going in the future? I mean, the bottom line is that government officials and a lot of capitals around the world are no longer prioritizing the economic benefits of these interactions over other considerations. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. So this is going to be a very difficult, future pathway for companies to navigate that are thinking in a very sort of rational cost benefits, profit maximization type of mindset, which is not where the US government is. It's not where the Chinese government is. And more, it's not where a lot of governments around the world are going.
Good thing that, as you mentioned, the private sector tends to be more nimble in its approach and can pivot. Oriana, thanks so much for that. Really interesting insights. Now we have a book club interview with Oriana coming up as well, so stay tuned for that. That's on Upstart, How China Became a Great Power. And we have more great U.S. election content right here on Circle One as part of the U.S. election special, so stay tuned.